We'll begin with Senator Mazzucato.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, for being with us. Like our chair said, very interesting. I think the message you're saying is very clear. You're very conscious of climate change. You're very conscious of the need to become more efficient, new homes as well as existing. But you want to make sure it doesn't cost you nothing, or it doesn't cost the homeowner nothing. And yet, I got to admit, when I look what's happened in Toronto, Vancouver last year or two, you got 35–50% increase in value, home value, for the last several years. I have a little bit of difficulty asking the government to make sure that they spend the R&D money and they spend the incentives, make sure the homeowner doesn't cost them a dime. I can appreciate your position, you're a home builder, but how do you sell that to Canadians? I mean, here they've profited immensely from its increase. The developers and landlords have made a lot of money, you know. Why would Canadians subsidize Canadian homes? So what if it costs a bit of money? Why not just impose it? A level playing field, new housing code, applies to all, done. Why subsidize?
Well, if you're talking about why subsidize new technology and figuring out how to build better homes, then I would suggest to you that you have to look at who's really benefited from what's going on with Canadian house prices. First of all, you're looking at Toronto and Vancouver, which have basically been priced out of the market for first-time homebuyers and a lot of young families. It's a major concern. You're seeing people, what's ending up happening, if you're concerned about climate change, what's happening in Toronto and Vancouver, people are moving further and further away, and you're seeing longer and longer commuting distances. The people who have benefited from that are existing homeowners, not new home buyers. So you have a big problem there. So you have a benefit. I mean, if you're a homeowner in Vancouver and Toronto, good for you. You've done really well in recent times. That's really great. If you're a young Canadian, a new Canadian trying to get into a household, you can't. You cannot buy a house in these places. So, and also, Toronto and Vancouver, there's benefits to it being a world-class city, but there's also major concerns because a lot of Canadians just can't afford to live in those cities anymore. Then you've got all of the rest of Canada, which is not Toronto and Vancouver, where young Canadians are having a really hard time. Here in Ottawa, people are having a hard time. We're seeing mortgage rule changes and all the rest. So I think you have to look at everything that's going into the price of housing, and certainly to suggest, well, let's slap on another $27,000 and that only new homeowners are going to have to pay that is completely missing the boat, because you're actually penalizing people who are already going to be buying a product that's many times more efficient than most of the houses on the market. Meanwhile, existing properties are where the solutions are needed. The other thing is the new technologies that are coming online need to be adjusted, because there's actually no reason for this to be the case. And I think that's a fundamental point we need to make here. We need to innovate. Sure, you know what? We could just regulate, and you can just cost Canadians tens of thousands of dollars, and you can lock more homeowners out of the market. I can guarantee you the people in Bouctouche, New Brunswick are not going to be saying, well, that's great because houses in Toronto went up by X amount, and by the way, we're not Toronto, we're not Vancouver, and I still can't afford to buy a house, and you just made it worse. So I think there's a huge opportunity here to take a leadership position and do it the right way, and I would, you know, I can tell you that most Canadians would not suggest that they're really interested in seeing prices go up because government regulated it.
But if R&D, in other words, you know, something more efficient, can get you with no price equivalent, no price increase, why don't the market? The market will get you there. If the housing price goes up and the technology is able to reduce it, they'll get there. But why have the government, why have Canadian consumers, and as you know, 99% of the homeowners are existing homeowners, why have them subsidize to get to your 0 point where it will get there? The market will work well.
No, the market doesn't work that way. I mean, you're talking about regulating a cost increase and forcing it to be a cost increase on.
But if they get innovation, they'll get it. Your renovation, if they find a way to do so and it's available to them, then it will come back to zero, like you're proposing.
Or it'll lock more Canadians out of home ownership, and you create a society of renters, and where you'll get split incentives, because landlords have no incentive to actually improve the energy efficiency of rental properties because they don't pay the energy bills.
Not true. Go ahead.
Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. A couple of things. First of all, you gave us good news that GHG emissions in the housing sector have dropped significantly, despite the number of houses having grown by 38% from 1990 to 2014. You may know, we just heard a presentation from the Canadian Construction Innovations Group, and they were talking about the broader construction industry, saying that unfortunately we're not making, overall construction broadly, we're not making progress. Greenhouse gas emissions have risen at 2.5% per year. And earlier in the work of this committee, we heard some evidence from government officials that efficiency gains in housing have been offset by the increasing size of residential and commercial floor space. Houses are getting bigger, the monster houses, and increasing reliance on personal electronics and other equipment. So I guess I'm just a little curious. You've told us about progress in the residential sector, but we've heard some different stories from the broader construction industry and from some commentators about houses becoming larger and less efficient. How does that all reconcile?
Sure. So first of all, when you look at the entire built environment, housing is different than large construction. So the commercial construction has not done nearly as well as the housing stock has. So that's part of the answer. The other side of things is in terms of energy efficiency and overall GHGs, dramatic improvements. Are there bigger houses? Yes. We're also seeing right now a tendency towards much smaller houses based on affordability. The entry-level houses are significantly smaller these days than some of the monster houses, bigger houses that are available on the marketplace. So, you know, the stats that we have are straight from Natural Resources Canada. So
Okay.
that's where those numbers come from. So there's reasons why you can look at it in slightly different ways, but in terms of our overall energy performance, as I said, compared to other sectors, actually, frankly, of the sectors that we were looking at, resident, transportation, industrial, the housing sector is the only one with numbers down. Everybody else is growing a little bit. And there's been a lot of activity. That's not just improvements and new activity, as I was saying, but there's been a ton of investment by Canadians and through retrofit programs to really get the existing housing stock in much better shape. Over 600,000 homes went through the Eco Energy Retrofit Homes program with an average savings of over 20%. So there's been a lot of activity to head that number in the right direction.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I was intrigued by your assertion that in praise of the energy retrofit tax credit. There is I've been involved in debates about tax policy within in the previous government, which introduced that program and then hesitated to extend it. The underground economic activity, reducing the underground economic activity was a real benefit of these programs. But you've done some studies or some research telling us this is an investment for the taxpayer and for the quality of houses. Can you share that research with us?
Mm-hmm.
And can you elaborate just a bit more? Is it pretty clear? I mean, I guess, how do you measure underground economic activity other than everyone's daily, perhaps personal experience? Is there data on that?
There is data. It's, of course, estimates, because unfortunately people who don't do cash deals tend not to, file their claims and all the rest. But there are estimates that the underground economy is, some $40 billion in Canada, and that through all sectors, over $10 billion in residential construction. Those numbers are probably conservative. And so when we've done the analysis, we've looked at all of the tax benefits that come from actually having people report. Because, of course, the typical cash deal is, hey, I'll re-roof your house and you pay me cash and I won't charge you the HST. average 15%, give or take, on the discount, but the actual, so not only are you using that little bit of HST revenue and GST and the provincial tax, but of course you're missing all of the income tax, corporate taxes, and everything else that goes along with it. So the loss from the revenue base is substantial. And when we look back at what occurred, particularly in 2009, you had the combination of two programs ongoing. One was the Eco Energy Retrofit Homes program, and the other was the Home Renovation Tax Credit, which was a one-year tax credit. The other was a grant program that ran for many years. But particularly in 2009, with a combination of those two things and the renovation tax credit applying to everything, you really saw that the underground economy dried up. And if you talk to anybody who worked in the home building industry, they'll be able to tell you in the renovation sector especially, Canadians were, it doesn't take much to get Canadians to do the right thing in this. And by saying you have to collect your receipts, but we'll give you a little tax break, and they were more than happy. So we really saw the underground economy dry up in that period. And it's part of the reason why we thought that program was very good for a variety of reasons. Moving forward, we would recommend that any such program be based on a tax credit rather than a grant program. It's easier to administer, it's easier to budget for, there's more flex in it, and most importantly, it has the greatest impact on home buyers and homeowners, because, you know, we work a lot with the Canada Revenue Agency, and sometimes they're trying to change their image and be more friendly. And our recommendation on this is, you know what? You are what you are, but you do carry a huge stick. And, you know, if you're worried about anybody defrauding this type of program, there's a big difference between, well, I made an erroneous claim to get a grant versus I defrauded the tax system, which is a criminal offense. And Canadians are aware of that. So we really feel like the tax system is a way to approach this. But I'm more than happy to provide the analysis that we did that shows how, you know, if you make assumptions on how much is underground and how that would come aboard from the different taxes, how that could come up to be, depending on how you do your assumptions, pretty close to revenue neutral.
Real quick, Mr. Chair, I respect Senator Massicott's view on federal investment in housing R&D, but you said it's been lagging in recent years. Could you provide us, not necessarily now, with some data on that? I'm just curious what form that federal investment has taken and how it's woefully lagged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we can, and you can just, if you look at the activities that are ongoing, there's three main federal departments, agencies that have engaged in energy efficiency research and development over the decades. CMHC, Natural Resources Canada, and the National Research Council. And through government cuts over the past 15 years or so, it's totally changed. I mean, the staff isn't even there anymore, particularly at CMHC in their research division. And so, yeah, it has changed. In the 80s and 90s, Canada was a world leader in cold climate building construction. It's why we are where we are today. It's why we were able to put the code in place in 2012, when it first went into the National Building Code in 2012. The reason that went in, and industry was, we were wholly supportive of that. The reason why, our 2000 preceded that, figured it out. Energy Star came in and made it a mass program. Over 20% of the houses being built in Ontario were being built to the Energy Star level of performance. So then when you codify that, you figured out the smart ways to do it. You've seen that Canadians are willing to pay for it. All the technology is in place. Now you can codify something and you don't get the hiccup in the marketplace.
Senator Duffy.
I wanted to follow up on Senator Patterson because the old reporter in me had me underlining this part of your presentation. Mr. Lee, you're saying that the home renovation tax credit and the eco retrofit program, do we have any idea how many thousands of homeowners brought their houses up to standard with that? How many applicants were processed?
Right, so there were, I don't have the latest stats, Natural Resources would, but my recollection is there were over 600,000 homes that actually did energy efficient upgrades through that program with an average energy improvement of over 20%. So it's pretty substantial. That program ended up touching about 13% of the Canadian housing stock, I think, low-rise housing stock by the time it was said and done. So it was a pretty substantial improvement. At a pretty substantial cost at the time. It was coupled with obviously the economic stimulus. The retrofit, both of those were about economic stimulus as much as they were about, you know, energy efficiency at the time with everything that was going on. Certainly the home renovation tax credit was 100% about economic stimulus.
But we're now doing an infrastructure, big stuff. Would this not be a complement to that to bring this program back?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would suggest that it could be done in a more targeted and strategic way so that you wouldn't have the same level of expenditure while still having huge benefits. So, yeah, I think it's right in there. I mean, depending on how, when you look at the investment in infrastructure and why it's being done, you can look at the housing as part of that infrastructure.
Mr. Morneau has been very busy. He was over meeting with us earlier today in the Senate chamber. Have you had an opportunity, and he's got one set of tax measures now he's dealing with, but he's got a budget coming in February. Have you, your association, made a pitch for this home retro program to him? And will you be doing that if you haven't already put one in?
Yes, we have. We did it in our pre-budget submission, and it was before the House of Commons Finance Committee a couple of weeks ago talking about it as well. So,
and it got a good reception?
As good a reception as you get at the from different parties around the table at a House of Commons Finance Committee. But I will say there was questions and interest from all around the table. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator McDonald. Net zero ready energy performances. That is a steep price tag, $27,000. You have the average there that was done in British Columbia. Of course, there's three type of averages. There's means, medians, and modes. I'm not sure which one. I suspect it's median average. I also suspect the number for Victoria would probably be different than Fort St. John.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a big chunk of money, big premium for a house, realistically.
Yeah.
Is it necessary, I guess what I want to determine from this, that would, let's say 27,000 give you 100% net zero ready energy performance. But is 50% of that cost trying to get the last 10%?
Yes.
Right? I mean, I suspect it would be. So would it be more realistic and easier to sell if we looked at a 90% advantage for half the cost?
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. You know, it's those marginal costs start to become really expensive.
Yeah.
And we're not suggesting for a moment that we can't get there. So let me make that clear, okay? I believe that we can get there. The question is, how do you do it in an intelligent way, in a way that's not going to unduly put hardship on Canadians for the wrong reason? Because frankly, getting to net zero by 2030, that's a really good thing to do. It's not going to solve our climate change problems in the housing sector, let alone for all of Canada. That's about the existing housing stock. The existing housing stock is where all the GHGs are right now. And if we built nothing but net zero houses starting today until 2030, we'd still be way behind in our climate change requirements for housing because it's about the existing housing sector, right? That's where it all is. So, you know, what we're really saying is let's work together. Let's put investment into place. Let's figure out the smart ways to do all of this, and let's codify in behind that, not out in front of it. And frankly, we've done it before. I told you the story of the Energy Star, our 2000 Energy Star Code. That's the thing, and we're saying let's do that again, but let's not codify out in front. And to say that by 2030 we're going to be at this point, well, what if it's still $27,000 to get to that point because of cost of construction and everything else, and energy prices haven't gone up very much? You know, there's an issue. So it's all about taking the right steps at the right time and putting the investment in for Canada to be a world leader again, which offers us export opportunities and everything else.
So in terms of meeting those targets, let's say we could meet 90% of the target with half the money. What's the low-hanging fruit there in terms of meeting that target? And the last 10% that is so expensive to get to, can you identify that?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we're facing right now is that we're looking at some step changes right now on how we build houses. We've sort of nailed all the low-hanging fruit to a certain degree. Like we're 37% better now than we were in 1990, 50% better than we were in 1985. I mean, those are some big jumps, and we've done some smart things. And by we, I mean Canada as a whole, through R&D, through government, and work in the industry and innovative manufacturers and all the rest. The next steps are not quite that obvious, and that we're at that point where the next increments are quite a bit more expensive. One of the big challenges we have is how do you insulate walls better? The obvious answer is, well, you just put in more insulation. That's not so obvious for two reasons. One is, structurally, now you're talking about a different type of wall system that becomes a lot fatter and more expensive to build. But on top of that, what's the big challenge we have? Land prices. So every time you build a fatter wall, you're taking square feet away from the interior of the house or adding it to the outside, which now becomes an issue with respect to land, and that now you're multiplying that by a lot. We worked on the new requirements for stairs in houses, and there was to prevent falls. And it was all about finding that sweet spot. It used to be the tread, the part you step on a stair, was the minimum was 9 inches. And there was, should we go to 10, should we go to 11? We landed on 10 because that covered about 90% of the falls for a fraction of the cost. And the big cost in stairs, it's not putting an extra inch on the stairs, it's the volume in the house. It was about $3,000 to put a bigger set of stairs into the house because of the volume that you're now dealing with if you're going to have the same square footage everywhere else. So that's the kind of thinking that needs to go into all of this to do it smartly.
Just one last question. I've asked this of our previous witness. Do you think we should, when it comes to smart and intelligent systems for monitoring and managing heat and air conditioning, everything else goes into the climate in a house, do you think it should be incorporated into the building code as something that's required?
Well, interestingly, as you move down the path towards net zero and net zero ready, you really you're basically talking getting rid of most of the heating and cooling requirements for the house. So that becomes actually less and less of a factor in terms of heating and cooling loads and hot water. Where you do see growing loads in housing is all the stuff that isn't affected by the building codes. It's everything that we all bring into our house and plug into the electrical outlets, from phones to stereos to TVs, and the phantom loads on a lot of these, which are the loads that occur when you're not even using. I think one of the best ones, it's not really a phantom load, but you've probably heard the quote that a microwave uses more energy during the course of the year when it's off just to run the clock than it does to heat the food that you use it for through the course of the year. Yeah. And so it's, finding smart ways to enable people to monitor the energy that they are using in their house. For a long time, through our leadership in Canada in cold climate building science and all the rest, what we never had a chance to really look at and invest in was monitors that told people how much energy they're using at any given time. That was a behavioral thing, but we're getting to that stage now where the behavior of Canadians and how they operate their home and what they plug in, like none of us have any idea how much the energy is being consumed by the things that we've plugged in our house. I mean, I've worked in this area for 25 years. I actually don't, other than I see my bills, but I don't know which things are taking a lot. And I think that, and so in our net zero home program, we are actually mandating you have to put in those types of monitoring systems and displays for homeowners, not because we think it should be codified, but because we want to see if it has any impact. Because there's another school of thought that says that's really good at the beginning and then people ignore it. So the question is that legitimate or is it not? So I wouldn't say it should be mandated at this stage, but I would say it's worth R&D, it's worth looking into, it's worth checking behavior for Canadians, seeing if it makes a difference, because the next big piece inside houses will not only be how we build the houses, but how we help people manage how they use the energy in their homes.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Well, some very interesting questions and interesting comments. I have just a couple of questions, and then I think we're done, sir. But $27,000 That's for an average house in average British Columbia. I guess you're talking average Lower Mainland is, would that be correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if, and I don't know what an average house costs in the Lower Mainland, but I'd suggest it's $1 million. So is the
Depends where, but yeah.
$27,000 an impediment to buying that house?
It's not an impediment to buying the $1 million home, but if you take that $27,000 and take the land prices out of it and put it in another part of BC or move it to Saskatchewan, where that number is going to be, the $27,000 will go way up because of the climate, and the house prices don't accommodate that, it makes 0 sense. Not to mention, does it really even make sense in the Lower Mainland of BC for what you're getting in return? So, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at Toronto, if you look at the core of Toronto and Vancouver and say, every house is $1 million, well then, you might as well add in, there's all kinds of stuff that government could throw in to make that house more expensive. That would be a nice social benefit. I'm not sure that that's actually in the best interest of Canadians or Torontonians to do that.
So I get from what you're saying is, as far as net zero goes, forget it. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, no, not at all.
No?
No, not at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. As far as net zero goes, it's about doing it on the right time frame. If you want to do it really quickly, then it's the time for joint investment from private sector and the federal government. If you want to regulate it, then regulate it in a way that you're not causing a cost impediment for Canadians. So we're saying we can get there. We've actually gone a long way over recent years. We're continuing to do that. Frankly, in the complete absence of a target, we'd still be pushing towards net zero. We're doing it on a voluntary basis with our members in our association anyway. We've been pushing the energy efficiency envelope ever since the 1970s.
So if we went, if there was some way to measure the net zero, and I don't know what that would be, just off the top of my head, but the housing stock that industry has built over the last 20 years would all meet that standard. Is that correct? Without any rules to say it's got to be net zero, I get what you're saying is we're already there. Why add $27,000 to it? Because the housing stock is, the built housing stock is so much better in the last 10 years, and I'll use 10 years, than it was 30 years ago. So are you saying that the housing stock that was built in the last 10 years, you could almost say it's all net zero?
Oh, gosh, no.
Oh, okay. Well,
No. We're working our way towards, we're not, the housing stock built over the last few years is, it's 37% better than it was, but it's still using energy, of course. But to get to those next level, as we work towards net zero, we're not saying don't strive for net zero. We're saying strive for net zero. We're saying don't regulate the steps until you know you're not going to cost Canadians too much. And we will, together we continue to innovate to get there. We may very well get to 2030 and have found those solutions, and it's great. And so regulation can come in and you're not knocking anybody out of the market. That would be fantastic. In fact, part of what we're working on at the association is to achieve just that. But it's irresponsible to regulate in this framework and in this time with housing affordability such an issue all across Canada without taking that as a concrete measurable approach. We want to work towards net zero, but let's do it in a way that Canadians can still afford to buy those homes. Oh, and by the way, we actually need to be working on the retrofit side of the equation where all the existing housing stock really needs to go up. Even the houses that are being built in the past decade, those are going to need to be renovated too to get to where we want to get to. How are we going to do that?
Okay.
Which is another, just one last piece is, the other thing is you talked about the emerging technologies and where we need to go. We don't have the technologies to really cost effectively retrofit existing houses. There's a huge challenge, and that's another place for huge opportunities for investment and Canadian leadership because it's not easy. Think about your own house, and if you wanted to improve it, how are you going to get more insulation in those walls? It's not easy. And think if you have an older house. Those are tricky technologies, and there's huge opportunity too.
I'd just like to, you've got $27,000 for an average house in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. I've been trying to drive it what this cost is gonna be, because for people that have houses now that are 20 years old or 30 years old, if you in fact said to them they had to go to net zero, the cost would, it wouldn't be anything like $27,000. It would be, I would assume, a heck of a lot more. Do you have any kind of numbers around that we could use that are substantiated for an average house that's been built in the 70s to bring it to net zero? Could, I'm not asking you would have that in the back of your mind, but is there something you could do and get some of that information to us so that we at least have a number? We have this one now for a new house, something that's built in the 70s, because there's a lot of stock out there in the 70s.
Yeah, there is. It's a pretty big task. I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, this work that I'm quoting is out of BC, and they spent, a bunch of money and a bunch of resources to get that done. It is something that does need to get done. I can tell you that the costing exercises in renovation construction are a lot of work. There's not a lot of standardized information around. That said, we can look into it. I can also tell you that the Government of Canada has historically been really well positioned to do this kind of work as well. Natural Resources Canada, who we work with as well, they have really good people, and in the past had more really good people who do this kind of work, and that's the same with on the building code. And there is talk about a retrofit code. You're saying, wouldn't it be expensive to, well, there's talk now, and in fact, some of it's starting to come in Ontario. It's going to be pretty pricey. So, yeah, we can provide some. I would suggest that, my recommendation to this committee would be, this needs to be a huge piece of the work going forward, and it's something that the government agencies should be hugely interested in and active on. Let's figure out the prices for all of this, and because we need to get them down over time.
I'm asking you because I want to get to the private sector. I've asked Natural Resources Canada, and they're a bit hesitant, or I shouldn't say hesitant, but they have every reason why they can't put it together, because it would scare the hell out of people, pardon me. And so what I want to get is something that we can actually use in a good way.
Sure.
But I think for me, Fred and Martha are important. Mm-hmm. They're the people that are going to pay the bill for all this.
Yeah.
And somehow, if we price them out of their places, I mean, some of the things that I've seen that have come across my desk about saying, well, you can't even sell your house in 2030 if it's not net zero, scares me. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what have you done to a whole bunch of people? And so those are the kind of issues that we're facing, and with all this net zero and how we're going to save all this, nobody has either priced out federally what it's going to cost per ton. Is it $1,000 a ton to actually fix an older house? Is there a different place you can get that same amount of tons that's a lot cheaper? And those are things that have to be looked at. So those are the kind of things. I have one more comment. When you say we have no way of measuring the energy we're using, actually, we do. At least when I was in government, and we put in net metering in British Columbia. Happened after I left, but it was me that initiated it. There were different companies that provided the installation in your home that would tell you exactly how much electricity, not natural gas, but electricity that you're using at any given moment of the day. Because net metering is actually meant to be that you charge higher at peak. Mm-hmm. That didn't happen in British Columbia because the public got mad at it, but so be it. But that's the reason, to get people's attention to saying, in the middle of the night running your dryer or something and timing it, or your dishwasher, makes a lot better sense for everything, not just you, but the systems that provide the electricity. And unfortunately, we never got to that piece, but it would have been a good piece. So you can measure, but not every individual little item.
And that's the trick, right? Yeah, of course, we have real-time measurement now, and you can even go on the web usually and see what you used yesterday even. So it's, and we can get real-time, but the real trick is, we think, is, well, what's using that energy and what can I do about it? Because a lot of the time you just have no idea. Like, how, is it my bar fridge? Is it the big fridge? Is it the freezer? Is it what I've got plugged in? And that's the real piece that could be interesting. Yeah.
Okay, Senator Duffy, you had a quick question there.
Chairman, I just wondered if Mr. Lee would also flip us materials he has on home renovation as opposed to net zero or as a complement to net zero. What could we accomplish through a home renovation program and enter, as we had a few years ago? And how much further would that take us towards the goal we want to go, as opposed to simply focusing on net zero? So if some of that research might be helpful too.
Okay. And if you provide that to the clerk, everybody on the committee gets a copy of your thing. So I think that's the end of our questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. That was very interesting information, and we might be back to you to try and dig a little bit more information out of you.
Perfect.
So thank you for appearing.
Thank you for having me.